Hello and welcome to my rebuttal to Jason's rebuttal and my closing to the argumentation that we are doing on the two questions: did Jesus rise from the dead, and does this prove God exists? During his rebuttal, Jason once again states that I must produce references for historians who agree with me on how to view history. However, again, this is not something I must do. Informal logic allows one to make simple or complex premises. It is up to the opponent to show that the premise is invalid or flawed in some way. My opponent does nothing to do this. My presentation of how historians view history is in line with the secular historian method that he employed, and I even utilized this method in my rebuttal. So my outline of how historians decide history stands. As I said, at best he might be able to get me to withdraw it, but he was unable to do this. My opponent suggests that I committed an ad hominem, a very strong point against me if I had indeed done this, but shockingly dismisses this as an issue. Had I in fact done this, then whatever point I made should be dismissed. I do not know of any time that I made such a fallacy, and I can only guess at what he might be referring to since he brings it up, but then dismisses it. It becomes an irrelevancy. But my duty to the forms of logic is such that if anyone can show me where I did make an ad hominem during my debate with Jason Burns, then I shall withdraw it from my argument in whole. Jason also said that I had a number of strawmen. My opponent says he's ignoring this issue. Later in the same rebuttal, he brings it up as a possible issue. So it's unclear what other strawman he might think I am using, and I can only comment on the one he does talk about, and the other possible strawman all become irrelevant. My opponent then says that I am begging the question in regard to Mark. He says this because I gave no citations or dates on the issue. But that's not what begging the question is. Begging the question would have occurred if I had made the question, or in this case statements, regarding Mark in such a way that it's overly aggressive and forces my opponent to answer in the way I desire, that I'm pre-assuming my answer. It would have to be a set of loaded sentences constructed to trick my opponent. I stated that Mark was written earlier than Paul. I stated that the story of Jesus' resurrection comes into Mark at a later date. Then I constructed a hypothetical structure that could explain how this happened. At no point during that do I force you into accepting anything that I say or structure my words in such a way that you are forced to agree. Thus, I never, ever beg the question. We return again to Jason demanding that I give sources for these dates and places and times, etc. But again, in informal logic, one does not have to do this. It can strengthen your case depending on what it is, and it certainly saves the audience some research on the issue. But it is not necessary to how debate functions. Jason made this demand several times, and each time was a logical fallacy. I'll tell you what logical fallacy later in this rebuttal. Let me address the bit of the rebuttal Jason has where he's trying to defend his poisoning of the well. You will recall that in my rebuttal, I brought up the red herring and poisoning of the well that Jason produced by talking about the atheists who took some issue with the deists from their group. How the atheist did or did not behave towards this person is not relevant to the debate. It's nothing more than a red herring, and attempts to poison the well by putting the idea in that atheists are mean-spirited or hypocrites or other issues. Jason defends his point by creating a new red herring, listing people who came up with the wrong idea about Jesus, then goes on to complain about some modern atheists that don't even bother to look at the history of Jesus. None of these issues are relevant, and all of them are red herrings. At no point does he ever defend his original fallacy, but instead creates all new fallacies. And once again, Jason complaining that I haven't produced citations. Jason could have saved himself a number of logical fallacies by simply looking up how persuasionary dialogue functions and learning that this is not a criteria. Because it's not a criteria, that means that every time Jason complains about this, he's producing the logical fallacy of an outright lie. Jason then laments that I come to the analysis as a, quote, anti-supernaturalist, end quote. This was my third argument in my opening. This would have been a perfect time to show why or how my premises are wrong, Jason instead tells me that I'm an anti-supernaturalist. Jason says that I do not show how I am coming to the question as an agnostic. Yet 2 of my 3 arguments were probabilistic in terms and allow room for correction. Only my 3rd is one of deductive logic. And he can complain all he wants that that's my position, but unless or until he rebuttals my premises in my 3rd argument, they stand as is. Jason makes the claim that the oldest material is from the Apostle Paul, and having looked up numerous dates and disagreements on the dates, I can't decide what I should believe on this issue anymore, and I formally retract my position that Mark is earlier than Paul. I must make this very clear. I'm unsure what book is earliest at this point. The scholars and historians have numerous dates, and the best I could do would be to average them out, making Mark and Paul's writings at around the same time. That means that the early versions of Mark still exclude the resurrection, and we know this from the various codexes and other sources that we have, but it also means that the Paul story was out around the same time and did include the resurrection. So there's 2 written stories of what were once oral stories. My hypothesis that the oral story evolved into the Mark-Paul can't hold, so I have to retract that hypothesis formally. My new hypothesis is that the Mark and the Paul that wrote this, or whoever it was that wrote it, had 2 different views on the same oral story. Mark didn't believe in the resurrection, but Paul did. So Paul penned it in, but Mark did not. Did Mark himself add in the resurrection later once he came to believe it, or was it someone else? Historians and scholars don't agree on who wrote in the resurrection to the Mark account. Some think it was Mark, some think that someone else. So the best I can say is that the most plausible explanation is that Mark penned it without, then later someone penned in the resurrection. But we can't decide who. Some do say that the Mark ending was there orally, but not penned in until later. But that still is the point that I'm making. It didn't appear in the earliest writings, and that gives me reasons to be skeptical. The next straw man that Jason brings up that I might have committed is one with the Pharisees, that they did believe in bodily resurrection. In the description box below, I'll put the sources that I looked up for these Pharisees, and my audience can decide whether or not I did in fact commit a straw man here. But Jason's original opening said that the Jewish people did not believe in bodily resurrection, leaving out information about what the Pharisees believe. This makes the statement that Jason made about the Jews not believing in the resurrection a half-truth. Now, for the end summary. Jason has an argument that can be summarized as some writings confirm that Jesus was a person, some historians agree that these are real history, and the Gospels say Jesus did supernatural things. My argument can be summarized as Jesus is a myth, God is a myth, and that there are no supernatural events. My opponent made a blunder that set him in a tactical disadvantage, followed there by other formal fallacies that indicate he does not understand how debate functions. This matters only for technical reasons and cannot be used to show that his argument is invalid. My opponent made several informal fallacies that do give us reason to be skeptical of his conclusion, and this does matter. I made no blunders, and at no point did I ever break from the agreed-upon rules or technical rules of persuasionary dialogue, indicating that I understand how debate functions. This matters only for technical reasons and cannot be used to show that my argument is valid. I submit that my only logical errors have been formally withdrawn by myself, and suggest to the audience if they find any logical errors that I produce that I would have to formally withdraw those, or that they must be skeptical of anything connected to them. Our questions were, did Jesus rise from the dead, and does this prove God exists? I said no to both and give my arguments for both. My opponent says yes to both, but only gave arguments for the first one, but not the last. Shockingly, Jason never connects the dots from Jesus' supposed resurrection to any God at all. I'd like to conclude now by thanking my opponent for his time and energy, and thanking the audience for their time and energy in this debate. I'd like to implore my opponent to always be willing to challenge what he holds most dear, and I'd like to implore my audience to do the same. We must all approach these argumentations with analysis that is objective, and decide who has a logically coherent argument and who does not. Whoever does not is one whose conclusions we must continue to be skeptical of.